Ali, thank you so much for joining the show. Seriously, it's a real honor to meet you and to talk to you about collective health. Why don't you? I mean, you have such a fascinating origin story for this company. Maybe we start there. What led you to start Collective Health?
Well, thanks for having me on, Clint. Yeah, it's a very personal story for me. I was about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, hospitalized out of the blue with a pretty serious illness. And after recovering from that, was very surprised to learn that half of my hospital charges had been denied for reasons that were very impossible, I would say, for me to understand at the time. And so that very naively inspired me to want to create a kinder, gentler health insurance company. And I quickly realized that actually we didn't want to be an insurance company at all, but rather enable the many employers in this country that pay for their employees' healthcare expenses kind of from their balance sheets to do that better, which was true to my own experience. And so that's what Collective Health does. We enable self-insured employers to design and deliver health benefits and health insurance plans with much better customer experience, much greater flexibility, much greater transparency than you can using a traditional health insurance carrier. And our hope is in so doing, number one, we can help support Americans a lot better than the health insurance industry does. The Net Promoter Score in health insurance is one of the lowest of any industries, and ours, thankfully, is an order of magnitude higher than that. And at the same time, also help American companies, which shoulder about half the total bill for healthcare in this country, to do it with much greater sort of influence, much greater leverage than they can using traditional means. I mean, the cost of healthcare, as you know, is rising and has been rising much higher than inflation for many, many, many years. And we think it's time that we started to use market forces to help bring that under control.
How does Collective Health do it? Is it like because you have a larger pool, or like what's the model exactly?
Yeah, actually, it's not a health insurance pool. It's rather honestly giving the keys, if you will, to the kingdom to those that are paying for the healthcare expense. So if you're a big self-insured employer, I mean, even if you're a massive self-insured employer, you don't really have a lot of control over, how your network looks, what kind of programs are offered, especially if you work with a traditional health insurance company. And so we enable big employers basically to mix and match different kinds of networks, different kinds of solutions, whether it's a very targeted solution to take care of people with diabetes in your population or fertility needs or whatever it is, and then to very quickly evaluate what's working and what's not, and then negotiate basically with the people that are providing the service on the other side with a lot greater power because you have the data to know what's costing what and what kind of return you're getting on your investment.
What is your overall take and sense for the way the United States does healthcare compared to other countries, and the burden of healthcare being placed on the employers to figure out? I know that happens in other countries too, but that is kind of an American model where it's like, all right, your job, and like if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance normally. What is your take on like the state of healthcare in the United States and the fact that it's tied to employers at all?
Yeah, so no doubt we have a bit of a wonky system. And you probably know the history of this, but it relates to wage controls after World War II. And effectively to keep wage inflation, under check, the US government granted private enterprise the ability to provide benefits, health and other benefits, in a tax protected manner. And that's kind of just the prevailing way the system works. That being said, we do have a national health service. I mean, people think we don't have nationalized healthcare. We actually do. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid. Medicare for people over the age of 65 and Medicaid for people below a certain income threshold. But you're right, for the vast majority of working Americans, 170 million plus people and their dependents, obviously, the private sector basically covers those costs. And I don't have a philosophical view on either. I mean, I think you could make a legitimate argument that private enterprise has served the US in other industry segments, and we've seen Moore's Law and other great economic benefits as a result of that. Healthcare just seems to be an anomaly in a lot of ways because we really haven't, again, given the people who are footing the bill the tools to do it well. And I think if you give them the tools to buy something intelligently, American employers have shown they can buy stuff intelligently, whether it's software or materials or whatever it is. So healthcare really should be viewed no differently, in my opinion.
Not to go like too deep on like the policy and politics of all of this, but we did have like this major healthcare bill or law passed in what was
Mhm.
like 2010, and, nicknamed Obamacare. What did that do? How did that
Yeah, I mean,
benefit or not benefit the system?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, if you want to be fair, it's really Romney care. It's like Mitt Romney put it in place
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Massachusetts before anyone else, and then all of a sudden became Hillary care and then Obamacare. I mean, yeah, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, the PPACA or ACA for short, um, was, I think, well intentioned in that it put a lot of protections in place that you basically allow people to get health benefit coverage or healthcare coverage for things that they absolutely should, but were being denied coverage for. So you think of things like pre-existing conditions that included conditions, quote unquote, like maternity, like if you were a pregnant woman before the Affordable Care Act, that was a reason to deny you health insurance coverage. So I think it provided a lot of protections and it set some minimum criteria for what a health insurance or health benefit coverage plan should include. I think like a lot of things, I think there were aspects of the bill or aspects of the law that were co-opted by the industry to make it maybe less user friendly and more economically favorable for the incumbency. And that's, part of the political process, I guess. But I do think the spirit of the law was good in that it kind of removed a lot of barriers to people getting health insurance coverage. The challenge then, and it kind of goes back to your prior question and my point about should employers cover the cost of care, it's not a mystery that we have a massive amount of federal debt. And you could
hmm
make the argument that, well, if the government is already so underwater from an economic standpoint, and private businesses have tons and tons and tons of cash as they do, maybe it's not a bad idea for the private sector to step in and help shoulder the benefit because, again, they are reaping the sort of tax advantages of doing that. So I think you could make an argument that the private sector should step in more. And the Affordable Care Act, I think, created a good framework for just healthcare coverage in general. But I think the private sector could step in more and help, I think, wrangle this industry more than it's been asked to do, I think.
We talk a lot about self leadership at CEO.com and what it means to lead yourself. And, if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead others, that type of philosophy. When you hear the term self leadership and where you think of self leadership, what does that mean to you? How do you enact it in your own life?
Yeah, it means a lot. I mean, I think, like you said, if you can't manage yourself, how can you be expected to manage others? I think in my case, sort of specifically, I'd say self leadership looks like a lot of time with my spouse and kids, and kind of the support and the identity that comes with that. I definitely identify as being a parent, as being a dad, if you will. And I think that helps set a priority order. Again, I think management to me is about establishing priorities and then making sure you focus yourself and the people who work for you on the most important things and maybe let the less important things fall by the wayside to a certain extent. So I'd say to me, like that's the foundational thing, kind of my family and my kids and my spouse and like everything else kind of a secondary to that. I do have like rituals and other kinds of things that I do personally that I think are important and help me stay grounded and help me stay energized. But I do think kind of starting with family first, for me at least, kind of is the ballast or like the rudder for everything else.
What does a typical day look like for you?
Usually it involves, getting up relatively early in the morning, spending some time with my kids, making them breakfast, depending on who's got driving duty, driving them to school. And then depending on the day, because we work a few days of the week, I'm in the office and a few days at home, could be coming into the office and, having meetings or, doing kind of just solo work or doing that from my home. And then like a religious practice for me, there has to be some time involved to do some kind of physical activity for me. That really helps kind of keep me grounded and keep me energized. So whether that's going for like a trail run or going to the gym or even potentially playing a sport occasionally every now and then, I definitely make time for that. And then, the evening is dinner and homework usually with my kids. I have a 16-year-old and a now 13-year-old as of this weekend. So a lot of time
Congrats.
spent helping them with homework usually in the evenings, and then lights out.
um,
Pretty boring, pretty boring, but
no, it's
it's my
actually
life.
the perfect life. I mean, it's I wish more leaders did that. It's incredible. Um,
Yeah.
Was you mentioned this in your answer about you guys work half out of the office, half
Mhm.
in home. What is your philosophy since COVID-19 kind of disrupted this whole like everybody at the office, and then we had to work from home, and now there's kind of like this option of bringing everybody back to the office, doing some sort of hybrid schedule. How has Collective Health handled that issue?
We've tried to do things organically, meaning there's been a natural pull already in the organization since the pandemic and obviously during the pandemic to want to convene. And we've tried not to be too heavy-handed in terms of what that looks like, but rather push the decision making down to the teams and then create a framework at a high level in terms of what we think the right balance point is. And it's something that we review constantly. Our chief people officer is very sort of highly attuned to the needs of our workforce and kind of what works and what doesn't for different populations. So where we've kind of settled is on a kind of roughly 2 to 3 day week, depending on where you are and what kind of function you're in. But then we don't provide much more guidance than that. It's like the understanding is there's probably some balance that's good of in person and solo at home type of work. And then the teams really should figure out what's the best sort of mix for them and what's the best way to allocate that time. Try not to be too prescriptive.
In the context of your role as CEO, how do you decide where to spend your time within the company?
Arguably, I'd say that's arguably the hardest thing that I face because there's a really broad and vast spectrum of things that I could be spending time on, whether it's, business development and relationships or technical stuff. And quite honestly, I can't say that I've got like a perfect balance. A lot of it in many ways is driven by just kind of what's immediate and is somewhat opportunistic. I mean, you do have to be responsive as a leader, as I'm sure you know. Um, but I try to leave some time every day, like a good 3 to 4 hour block for just kind of self-directed work. And for me, that looks a lot like reading a lot. I try to read a lot of trade stuff. I tried to read like a lot of internal documentation, and then that often spurs me to think about stuff that maybe I should be spending more time on.
Is there a singular experience or moment that you look to that kind of changed your view about what it means to be a leader?
I'd say there are many. I think probably one of the most, yeah, I'd say probably one of the most important was starting to assemble an executive team that wasn't exclusively made up of myself and my co-founders. It sort of forces you in many ways to take stock of, where you're at and then what kind of organization you want to create. And obviously, when you inject new DNA like that, other than the founding DNA, there's always a risk that it doesn't work out. And so I think one of the things that really brought into sharp focus for me was just how important my role as kind of a bridge builder needed to be and an interlocutor between various, people needed to be. I know it's not always been smooth sailing, but I'm happy to say that it's been largely smooth versus some of the very turbulent stuff you might read about in the press. And then I'd say the other thing that's been really impactful in terms of thinking of my role as a leader is as we started to open offices and hire people across the country, trying to maintain that cultural consistency across, state and city borders and stuff like that. That's always also a challenge because every part of the country has its own unique culture, and the hiring pool is different in, you know, the Dallas area than it is in the San Francisco area is just one example. And so just, trying to maintain consistency culturally across all of those sites while also providing, because I think it's important and I think there's a lot of benefit to it, the ability for those local areas to influence your culture in return, has also been something that has been really, really interesting, challenging, and a major growth opportunity for me as a leader.
I see you have the book AI Superpowers behind you, and
Yeah.
every single CEO and leader is thinking about how artificial intelligence is going to change everything. And obviously, artificial intelligence isn't new, but it's kind of become the topic of the moment over the past year. How are you thinking about AI? How are you thinking it affects collective health? And the health industry, and maybe even just beyond the health industry, what are we looking at here over the next 5-10 years?
It's a good question. I would first respond by saying I have a bit of an allergic reaction to the use of the term AI. Having programmed neural networks myself at some point in my academic and professional career early on, I think it's a term that's highly misused and overused. But what I would say generally is there's no question there is ample opportunity for the use of software and machine learned based techniques to improve everything from operational processes to customer experience. I mean, just think about how personalized a lot of your software and other experiences are today, from Netflix to your iPhone to whatever. And then obviously, there's a lot of machine learning that powers that. I think AI, in the most kind of recent incantation of it, in the sense of like generative AI and large language models, definitely have their place. I don't think they're a solve for everything, like a lot of people are saying, but I do think they have their rightful place in the, armory of different kinds of software and data-based machine learning techniques to improve, again, efficiency, and quality, and then ultimately the user experience. And we are experimenting with, all sorts of different kinds of machine learning and, AI or AI-like systems internally that, could impact everything from the end user experience in one of our apps to, how we process data in our data pipelines and ingest data and connect external parties to our platform and to our systems. And there's a lot of promise, and we've already made a lot of progress using those kinds of techniques.
Yeah,
And
it's
so I think as a
interesting.
CEO, if you're not thinking about it over the next 5 years, yeah, you're missing out for sure. But I would say that you've been missing out for the last 20 if you haven't been
Right.
thinking about it.
Yeah, it is true. Like AI is not new. And it's kind of
No,
like we're all
it's
kind of
not.
talking like it's a brand new breakthrough or anything like that. Large language models, you could argue, is a breakthrough, but AI itself, no. And even large language models, just like OpenAI has figured out how to like commoditize that and make it digestible to the public, right? Even that's been around
Right,
for a while. I wonder, is
right.
you like in this context, like of AI, and I guess the concern now is like what happens when we get to artificial general intelligence, right? What happens when we get to AGI, and maybe we already have gotten there. Who knows? Like who knows what just happened with OpenAI and Sam Altman, and like maybe they got there or maybe they didn't. Do you have any concerns around AGI? I never really understand the doomsdayers because I never really there's never like an explanation of like how AI is going to destroy the world, right? And like
Right.
what that means because it is. Can't you just unplug it? Can't you? It all is just math and code at the end of the day. And so, do you have any concerns around AGI or the future, or like its ability to extinct or make mankind extinct?
Yeah, it's funny. I have the same kind of feeling about all this stuff. I'm much more of an AI, quote unquote, optimist, if you will, than a pessimist. And I do think the doomsdayers, many of them either have an agenda that they're, pushing by kind of, espousing that kind of a philosophy publicly, or they don't really understand the technology all that well. And it's probably a mixture of both, to be honest. I'd say that just like any other technology, you know, nuclear fusion, biochemical engineering, it can be abused by bad actors. And I think there's valid concern around that and the need to have regulation and other sort of ways to supervise and to inspect, if you will, how these things are being used and what underpins them so that you don't allow bad actors to exploit them. I think what's interesting about generative models in particular is they have the ability to create things out of things that they've been trained on, obviously. And I think with that comes a potential real capacity to overwhelm various systems. I mean, think about all of the deep fakes and other stuff that you could really supercharge with a really powerful generative LLM model. And so, I think there is valid concern around that. That disinformation is already rampant on so many social platforms, and I think this could like make it even more so. So I think those kinds of concerns are valid, and I think that's why the sort of the federal government and other regulators are starting to think about how do we regulate this while not also hindering the advancement of the tech. But I'm with you. I don't see personally, I don't foresee a Terminator like Armageddon scenario. I think these are very powerful productivity enhancing techniques and capabilities. But I don't think this is the T2000 that's going to come and murder us all. I could be wrong, but I just don't see that.
Well, if we're wrong, it won't matter. So,
I
I
guess,
wonder.
yeah, I guess.
I
I think we're going to burn ourselves to death through climate change before
Yeah,
an
I think we have
AGI,
more existential
kills us.
threats. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
that
I
AI is our
agree.
number one existential threat. That's for sure.
100%.
There's a lot out there.
Yes,
I mean, nuclear
there is.
weapons are one, right? Like, and
Yeah,
so I would put that above AI, honestly. I
yeah.
wonder, like, in the healthcare industry, staying on, this is my last question about AI. I wonder, like, what type of jobs it might replace within healthcare.
Hmm.
I'm thinking particularly like around like medical billing and coding and things along
Hmm.
could it handle that and like replace those types of jobs, and then those types of people are managing the AI? Or I mean, what do you think of it as in terms of like it will displace jobs for sure? How will it do that within healthcare, and then what jobs are created from it? Are you thinking?
Yeah, so I don't think AI is going to be much different than other technologies. I mean, whether it's the steam engine or printing press or whatever, in terms of upskilling jobs or making jobs more, more powerful and more highly leveraged because of the technique. And so, yeah, I do think there are a lot of very mundane, automatable tasks that not even AI, but just like basic machine learning can replace. And I think replace is a word that I don't love because I think that implies that there's going to be a perfect substitution effect in the workforce, and that's never the case. Usually there's some
Mm-hmm.
kind of adaptation to the workforce. And so I do think jobs will become more AI enabled and more AI powered. And sure, some jobs will likely be, lost as a result of that, but I think they will be more than replaced. I mean, our unemployment rate has never been lower, even though technology has never been more advanced. And so I think, to me, again, going back to being an AI pessimist versus optimist, I'm an optimist because I think it'll actually enable certain kinds of scenarios that are just simply inconceivable without the technology.
Who's an example of a leader that you really admire?
There's many, because they're not just leaders in the business world, they're also leaders in the political and kind of social spectrum. Um, I absolutely have a huge fan crush on a few of our founding fathers, just because if you think about the context within which our country emerged, it was not a foregone conclusion that the United States would be a successful experiment. So, whether it's folks obviously like George Washington or, you know, President Adams and others, like there's a lot of wisdom, I think, that our early forefathers had. It's obviously reflected in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that I think were really very, very, very prescient and well ahead of their time. I mean, there are issues we continue to grapple with to this day, as you know. And so obviously they were standing on the shoulders of giants themselves. The ancient Greeks had talked about democracy, millennia ago. But I do think that there's a lot of wisdom to be gleaned from reading about the lives and sort of the practices and the approaches to living that our founding fathers had that to me make them among the most interesting role models to try to emulate if you can. It's a very
Oh, for
different
sure.
time, obviously, but it's really interesting. I
Yeah.
think there was also a lack of kind of publicity seeking that they had that really resonates with me. A lot of them were kind of reclusive, which was really interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And another fascinating thing about them is they kind of knew that what they were doing was going to be historic. Like they kind of knew
Hmm.
it, in their lifetime, like as they were doing it, like, hey, this
Yeah.
is like going to be studied for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Like we can't screw this up. There was like this
Yeah.
kind
And
of
they
like
all
this is history.
totally. And I think they also knew that what they were doing wasn't a foregone conclusion, meaning you'd have to keep working at it for pretty much
Mm-hmm.
ever.
Yeah,
And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. It's like, yeah, it's not like you just kind of spin the die and it keeps going. No, no, no. You have to constantly be adding energy to this to make sure that it continues. And obviously, we're seeing that today. I'd say in terms of modern business leaders, I mean, there are a lot of people I think to choose from. I am a big fan, just personally, of someone like Bill Gates, just because I think obviously he's revolutionized a lot of different industries. But I think what he's also chosen to do with his personal life, in terms of trying to eradicate disease, especially given that I'm in healthcare, is really, really impressive. I mean, what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done is, I mean, I'd say nothing short of revolutionary in some respects. And it's just like he's relentless in wanting to eradicate lots and lots of diseases in the impoverished parts of the world, which I think is very admirable.
what role do you think empathy plays in leadership?
A huge one. I mean, I don't know how you can be an effective leader if you don't have it. Even I'd say some of the leaders that are lionized and kind of like the public press for being, you know, I don't know what you call it, swashbuckling or even borderline tyrannical, if you
Yeah,
want to
like
call it
Steve
that.
Jobs is like an asshole, right? Like that's a good
No, but
example of it.
he must, he had tons of empathy. There's no way that you could
Absolutely.
motivate and assemble a team without it. And I think the press tends to want to focus on those maybe unsavory or maybe more bombastic aspects of his personality. But like, there's no question you cannot motivate and orchestrate without having empathy. How can you relate to
Absolutely.
somebody when you're talking to them if you don't?
Absolutely. There's no way that he wasn't in the vast majority of the time super empathetic and able to get the best ideas out of people. It's just not possible. That's not true. But yeah, you're right. The media focuses on like the insane, like you've got to be, and then what happens out of that is really interesting because when the Walter Isaacson bio came out about him, everyone was like, "Well, I got to be like that." I like the most extreme stories. You know what I mean? It's like, no, that's not good. That's not a good thing.
No, it's a caricature of who he was. It's not who he was.
Yeah. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts
totally.
on you mentioned earlier the fact that our unemployment rate is so low, but then again,
Hmm.
inflation is so weird. We're living in this really interesting economic time. Like, what are your thoughts on like the macroeconomic environment, what things might look like going into the next year, whether we're on the verge of a recession, whether we've avoided a recession in the United States, and then like globally. I mean, there are some countries who are already in a recession. I wonder,
Hmm.
what do you think? Like, this is odd, right? Like this low unemployment, but still, the vast majority of the country doesn't feel like we're in the right place economically. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, so as someone who studied macroeconomics as kind of my focus in school, I'd say it's not actually that weird and not that unexpected to kind of be in the state that we're in. Um, there have been many examples of supply shocks, whether it was like the oil embargo in 1973 or others, where that can really tip the balance very quickly in terms of driving underlying asset and resource prices, which then have a pretty insidious knock-on effect on everything downstream. And I think, unfortunately, the pandemic and the supply chain disruption that caused was kind of like one of those shocks that really kind of tipped things over. But I'd say it was already kind of on the path to being tipped over because of cheap credit. I mean, we've had interest rates that are effectively zero for almost a decade. And that is great in terms of driving investment and driving economic growth. But there's a pretty nasty sting in the tail to that if it's not well managed in the form of the inflation that we're dealing with, which is sorry, always more stubborn to control than you expect it to be. And so, I think we have a very similar, in some ways, not entirely, but situation to what we had in the late 70s, early 80s. And it does take some strong medicine, and it's not popular to raise interest rates to try to tamp inflation down. And it's starting to have an impact. Like you see gas prices, falling, home prices falling, just because it has a chilling effect on the economy intentionally. People hate it because they're accustomed to being able to spend and accustomed to growth and accustomed to transaction volume. And when that goes away, it can be pretty upsetting. But hopefully people remember that like once prices are more under control, then things will feel a lot better. And this is where kind of going back to healthcare. I mean, healthcare has been growing in terms of per person cost per year at 3 to 4 times the CPI for like 25 years. And that's why you see healthcare growing from 8 or 9% of GDP back in 1980 to more than 20% of GDP today. And what's problematic about that is it takes away from other parts of the economy. And I'm taking more money out of your wallet to pay for your insulin or pay for whatever drug that you have to take, then that's money that you don't have for other things. And that's why I think it's very important for us to focus on trying to control inflation in healthcare as much as we can.
Is there a moment as a leader where you may have failed or not lived up to your expectations that kind of became a catalyst for you to become a better leader?
Uh,
Like something you learned from?
fail every day. I do something really, really not very smart, and my team reminds me of it. And yeah, it's an opportunity to learn. I'd say in terms of like big crucible moments, I mean, I think, I've started a couple of companies before Collective Health, and, they weren't wild success stories. And I'd say the humility and the learning and the circumspection from those experiences are probably why I've been able to do a better job here than I would have otherwise done. I think, if you're not, it's nothing, earth shattering to say, if you're not failing, you're not trying. And I think people need to fail. People, just like kids need to make mistakes, stub their toe, etc., in order to learn that, oh, that's what that leads to. I should probably do things differently the next time.
I can't tell you enough how much it means to us to have you on the show. Seriously, your wisdom and what you've built at Collective
Thank
Health is
you.
so incredible. We end every interview the same way because that is at CEO.com. We believe the chances one gives are just as important as the chances one takes. I wonder when you hear that, who comes to mind is who gave you a chance to get you to where you are today.
Oh my gosh, where do I start there? I mean, whether it was my parents. So my parents were political refugees from Syria. My dad actually was sentenced to death in 1963 for basically advocating for a pluralistic and democratic form of government.
Oh my
And so I
gosh.
think the sacrifices that my parents made, moving halfway across the world while pursuing an education and creating a safe environment for my brother and I to excel and to achieve, probably, I mean, that's like higher than anything else for me in terms of that pecking order. But I've had a lot of help along the way. I mean, whether it's elementary school teachers in Menlo Park, California, or college professors at Stanford and at Oxford, or professional mentors at places like Goldman Sachs and Microsoft and Yahoo. Like I've had the benefit of learning from some really, really, really smart people who didn't have to take the time to kind of help me out when I was foundering or not sort of doing my best to kind of help me readjust and recalibrate. But there are many, like way too many, I'd say to count or to mention. I'd say one leader in recent memory that was really impactful for me was my kind of big boss, if you will, at Yahoo, Jeff Weiner, who became the CEO of LinkedIn, who's also an angel investor in Collective Health. He was just really good at kind of pointing pointing out flaws in my professional and other capabilities, but without making me feel bad about myself. He'd be like, "Hey, I saw that you did this. I think this could have been more effective. Here's why." And there's something really powerful about people who can do that and not make you feel terrible about yourself. I'd say Jeff Immelt, who's on our board, former chairman and CEO of General Electric, is another one who does that really, really well. I make plenty of mistakes, and he's really good at helping me understand when I make those mistakes, but without making me feel terrible.
Ali, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and congratulations on everything you're building with Collective Health. I'm sure that we will talk to you again down the road. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Clint. Really nice to meet you.
Likewise.